Hey, it's Lindsay and Brandy, and this is Real Therapy Gone Wrong, where we talk about therapy and mental health representation in movies and TV. While we are licensed therapists in real life, this show does not constitute therapy. Today, we are discussing the show Shrinking, Season 1, Episode 2, titled Fortress of Solitude, which can be viewed on Apple TV. So take it away, Brandy.
Okay, Fortress of Solitude. This episode aired in 2023, and I wanted to give a little bit of background. This is only the second episode of the show, but I think it is important to know what happened a little bit in the first episode to set the scene.
Yeah.
So, Jimmy Laird, played by Jason Segel, is the main character of the show. And in the first episode, we find out that his wife, Tia, has died in a car accident. And he's he's basically a therapist who he's really grieving, and he just kind of becomes unmoored in his advice giving to clients.
Yes.
So he starts just saying exactly what he thinks. And for example, he tells one client, her name is Grace. She's played by Heidi Gardner from SNL. And he convinces her to leave her abusive husband. And there's another client named Sean who has anger management problems. He's played by Luke Tinney. And he's a veteran and he has these violent outbursts. And so Jimmy enrolls him in mixed martial arts training. And so
And
initially it's
speaking really quick, speaking
yeah,
of the character Grace, not only does he like convince her to leave her shitty husband or whoever, like whatever relationship she's in, he basically gives her like an ultimatum. It's like if you don't leave him, you can't continue coming to therapy. Yeah. So
yes.
it's very like not only blatant advice giving, but it's clearly unethical
It's
what
very
he's doing.
coercive.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes. And so then um, he keeps it a secret what he's doing from his colleagues. So he works in this group practice owned by a man named Paul, who's played by Harrison Ford, just like chef's kiss for the
Oh,
character of Paul.
lovely. Yes. I
Love
love
him
him
so
so
much.
much.
Um, yeah, because he knows he's being unethical. So there's a
Yeah.
part of him that's like, fuck it, I don't care. And then there's a part of him that knows what he's doing is wrong. And so he is trying to keep it a secret what he's doing. He also has a daughter named Alice, who's played by Lukita Maxwell, and their relationship has been strained since Alice's mother's death. So at the end of the first episode, Jimmy goes with Sean, his client, to his daughter's soccer game. And Grace's husband, Donnie, finds him there and starts to beat Jimmy up. And Sean beats Donnie up in retaliation. So we have this counselor at his kid's soccer game. His client's husband finds him to beat him up. And his other client that he has brought with him gets in the fray to save him. So that's setting
It's
the scene.
a hot ass mess. I
It
mean, it's a
really is.
hot, like even being at a just if nothing happened, but you were just at a soccer game with your client, that would still be really weird. To be
Yes.
anywhere in public at an event with an active it's just weird. And then you've got all the right, like the husband of a client wanting to beat you up, another client defending you. So weird. And as the show goes on, like he still keeps seeing Sean as a client, which
Yes.
there's more to that, but it's very odd, right?
For sure. And we'll definitely talk about why we should not blur the lines between ourselves and our clients like he's
Hmm.
doing. So on this episode was written by Brett Goldstein of Ted Lasso fame. I think it's one of the reasons this show is so good because he is just incredible. And it was directed by Rai Russo Young. And at the beginning of this episode, we see Jimmy sitting in his kitchen. He has a black eye because he's been in this fight at the soccer game. And he's talking to his daughter, Alice. And he kind of awkwardly invites her to have dinner with him, but she says she's having Taco Tuesday with Liz. Liz is a neighbor played by Krista Miller, and she stepped in as a surrogate parent to Alice, and they have this really close bond. So you can tell Jimmy's kind of bummed, but also neither of them is really talking about their feelings and what's really going on. Like they're
Mhm.
just skirting the issue a lot. So Jimmy calls Paul, who again is his boss, played by Harrison Ford, for advice. And Paul says he has to be patient until people are ready. So basically saying, like, wait for Alice to be ready. And then Jimmy goes to bail Sean out of jail, which again, something we would not do for a client. And then Jimmy gets his best friend Brian, who's played by Michael Urie, to defend Sean. So we're just
Mhm.
creating like a dual relationship, triple relationship, all of these
Oh,
really
there's
wrong.
so many blurred lines. And going back to Harrison Ford's character, and this is like part of why the writing is so good, why his character is so good. He because he like Jimmy like leaves the door open for his daughter to have dinner with him, and she's like, "Oh, I'm gonna be busy, whatever." And when he calls Harrison Ford, I cannot. What is his character's name again? I cannot.
Paul.
Paul. I don't know why I always
Yeah.
forget that. But he calls Paul and he's like, "Hey, I took your advice and left the door open for Alice to have dinner with me. And she basically told me to go fuck myself. So, like, great advice." And he's like, "Your advice isn't working for me." And Paul says, "Well, yeah, that's tough because you've been trying it for like 10 minutes." And
Yes.
which is hilarious because don't you want to say that to clients sometime? You give like really solid like intervention or technique or advice or whatever, and they try it once and they're like, see, it doesn't work. And his whole
Yes.
point is you've got to give it time. You have to have
Yes.
patience. So it was a funny scene, but also very sound advice for someone who is like barely trying this approach.
Totally. And especially like with parents, I think this comes up a lot. Like I tried XYZ with my kid. Okay, well, how many times did you try that? Once. Okay, well, the whole point of parenting is we're a stable, consistent person that the kid can be securely attached with. So,
Yes.
yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out.
Yeah.
He tried it for 10 minutes. Okay, so back to Jimmy getting his best friend Brian to represent Sean. Jimmy and Brian have been estranged for a year. Brian is this hilariously gay character. He's an estate lawyer. He's not even a criminal defense lawyer. So we have a little bit of that, and we'll see more of that in a few more scenes. But then it goes into scenes with clients. So first, Jimmy sees Grace. So this is the woman he's convinced to leave her husband, and he sees her on telehealth, and Jimmy has a black eye from the fight, and so he is only putting like one side of his face on the camera. And Grace, the character Grace, is like, I can't see all of you. And then Jimmy just holds up the computer, but still is only showing half of his face, and like swirls around and like blames it on like the technology and is like, well, I have to go, and then just hangs up. So he's totally like gaslighted her about the
And
camera
when
situation.
and when you see her point of view, like her view of him, and you just see half of his face, it's so hilarious because we know why he's doing it. And she's like, I can't see all of you. Why are you hiding from me?
The next client is well, first I wanted to talk about why don't we tell clients to leave abusive partners? Let's chat about that.
Yeah. Um, there's a lot of reasons, but honestly, it's because one, they're probably not going to really do it, which like ends up being the case in this show. Like she's kind of telling because I think if you tell a client blatantly what to do, they don't want to lose their relationship with you. So a lot of times they're going to go like, "Yeah, you're right. I'm going to do it. I left them." But then they're going to be hiding what they're really doing from you, and then therapy doesn't really become productive anymore because now they're having to lie to you, the therapist, to like keep this relationship because they don't want to disappoint you. And then, like, you get what I mean? I just feel like if you blatantly tell a client what to do and they're not ready to do that, they're not going to do it. And then you don't get to process with them what it's like to be in that relationship anymore because you're under the ruse of like they're no longer in it.
Yes. Also, I was thinking about scaffolding, like, it's our job to help the client learn to scaffold themselves so they
Yes.
can make a decision. It's like, if you have a cut that's 7 layers deep, if you just put a Band-Aid on the top of the cut, you're not gonna help anything else heal, and
Yeah.
our job is to help scaffold them so that they can make whatever choice is right for them. Also, who the fuck am I to know what's right for someone else? Like, I don't want the responsibility of that decision either. Like, they have to have their
No.
own process around that.
Yeah, our job is to empower them. And if someone is in an abusive relationship, we would definitely point that out. Like, hey, this
Oh,
really sounds
100%.
abusive. I'm really concerned about you. Like, we can give the facts of what we're seeing. We can express our concern. We can inquire with them, like, kind of helping them figure out why they remain staying in this relationship. But ultimately, the decision of what to do about that relationship is theirs, not ours. So when you blatantly tell someone, it's definitely crossing a line for sure.
For sure. Yeah, I know you and I both do an abuse inventory with clients when we suspect there's abuse present, and talks about there's one area for financial abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional
Mhm.
abuse, isolating people from their families. And so it's really a nuanced subject. And it's really important for us to help the client understand, hey, this is abuse, and how can I help you decide what to do about it? But for sure not to coerce our clients into saying, I won't keep seeing you if you don't, end your
Well,
marriage.
because it
That's
also
ridiculous.
feels very victim blamey to me to be like, you've got to get it together and leave, or else I'm no longer going to see you as a client. To me, that is such a victim blame because you and I both know if you're in an abusive relationship, it's really difficult to leave, extremely
A
difficult to
hundred
leave.
percent.
And that's not the victim's fault. So yeah, just totally icky what he's
Really
doing.
icky. I'm glad they picked this as one of the things that he is doing that's unethical, though, because I think it's important to point out. And the show, I think, does a good job of pointing out, like, don't do this.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's go to the next client. It's Dan. He's played by Mike Nelson. Dan is lonely, and he tells Jimmy he's lonely, and then Jimmy starts to tell Dan that he is really lonely too. And so they go to get coffee during the session. And after they order, Jimmy says he'll buy him coffee. But then after they order, Jimmy says he has to leave. And so he leaves his client alone at the coffee shop to pay for these coffees. And I mean, he shouldn't go to the coffee shop really with his client. I could see sometimes how that might be appropriate if that's the only place you could meet. Like
Yeah.
one time, my counselor had construction at her office, and I didn't want to not have session. So we had session at a coffee shop, but that was my choice, right?
Yeah.
In this situation, Jimmy's like, "Hey, I'm lonely too. Let's go for coffee," and is meeting Jimmy's needs and not meeting the client's needs.
Well, can we also talk about how weird the self-disclosure was here? Like, I'm a fan of self-disclosure. I'm a
Me
huge
too.
fan of it. I self-disclose a client. Like, clients do know things about me personally, but I think I do a pretty good job of like keeping it in line, right? Like, you never want to make the session about you. The way Jamie expresses his loneliness, as a client, I would be worried about him because he's like,
Yeah,
it fucking sucks. I'm so lonely. And it's just awful. You know, I mean, he just kind of goes a little bit too far into it. And I'm like,
for sure.
oh, I don't know if I like that.
Yeah, that would be really awkward as a client. Like, I'm thinking about my therapist, if she just started talking about how sad and lonely she was, I would be like, I'm leaving now. I don't this is not why I'm
It's
paying you."
it's uncomfortable and it's different than saying, "Hey, I know what it's like to be lonely." Right? Like I can relate to
Right.
that feeling, but he was saying it as if like in this moment I am the loneliest I've ever been. It's like,
Yeah,
"Whoa. I don't know if I want to know about that."
seriously. Yeah, so clients aren't really they aren't here to meet our needs, emotionally or otherwise. So
Yeah.
So the meeting that Jimmy had to leave to go to is a meeting with the school counselor and Liz. Remember, Liz is the neighbor who
Mhm.
is sort of playing mom to Alice. And they're talking about what's going on with Alice. And it's really clear that Jimmy can't do this meeting without Liz. So it's really clear just how little he knows about Alice and what's going on in her daily life. Then we cut to a conference room and we see Brian, who's the gay lawyer,
Mhm.
and Sean, who's the client who helped defend Jimmy at the soccer game, and Jimmy. And they're on one side of the table. And then Donnie, the Grace's husband who came to the soccer game to beat up Jimmy, is on the other side of the table with the lawyer. And Brian successfully defends Sean from a lawsuit. And then afterwards, he says, I'm Atticus Finch. I'm Juliana Margulies. I'm Elle Woods. And I was like, that is the gayest line. Like, I just
Yes.
loved it. It was hilarious. He's so proud of himself. He wants to celebrate with ice cream. Jimmy says no, he can't. And then Brian invites Jimmy to play pickleball, which they keep referring to as America's fastest growing sport, which is hilarious and I think also true.
Yeah.
But Jimmy declines. So then Paul and Alice, so Paul's Jimmy's boss, Alice Jimmy's daughter, they're sitting on a park bench, and it becomes clear that Paul has been meeting with Alice clandestinely for a while, and he encourages Alice to play the part of Jimmy's daughter. During that talk, she spills the beans about the fight that Jimmy was a part of, because Jimmy was hiding the fact that this fight had happened
Mhm.
because it resulted from some very sketchy behavior on his part. Alice also refers to this therapy that she and Paul have been doing, and Paul says, "This isn't therapy, and don't tell your dad."
Mhm.
And I think that's ethically blurry also. Um, I think it's fine for someone to be like a mentor to someone, but
Yeah.
to say don't tell your dad is a little like if a grown man told my teenager, don't tell your dad we're meeting together, that it just feels a little sketchy and
It
unethical to me.
it is a little sketchy. And it's also it's difficult because like Paul is such a great character. Like, as a viewer, his intentions are probably really great. Like, he cares about
Yeah.
Alex, but it still doesn't negate the fact that he is this old man telling a high school girl, don't tell your dad we're
Yeah.
meeting, and this isn't therapy, but it kind of is therapy in a way. I mean,
Yes.
like, it seems therapeutic in nature the way they're talking to each other, right?
Yes. Like, I think if Alice made a complaint to the board, about Paul saying that he was doing therapy without parental consent, like, I think it would be hard for Paul to defend that against the board. Not that she's
Right.
gonna do that, but that's
Yeah.
one thing that I think about when I'm trying to think about my own ethics is if someone made a complaint to the board about this, how what would happen or how would that look?
Mhm.
And, like, in this case, he's doing therapy with her, even though he's not calling it therapy.
Yeah.
So, in the next scene, Brian, the lawyer, barges into Jimmy's session with a client and starts berating him for his year-long absence as a friend. And the way they wrote the scene is hilarious, obviously, because they write Brian sort of over the top a little bit. But it's also horrifying to think about from a client's perspective. And in the scene, I was like, in real life, Jimmy would take Brian into the hall. Like he wouldn't
Yes.
just sit there and do nothing.
Yes, because it went on for a good 2, 3 minutes. Like, this was like a long it wasn't like he opened the door and was like, "Oh, I'll talk to you later." No, it went on for quite a long time. The client is just sitting there on the couch. And it's also, I mean, it is a comedy show, so this is a client that like holds their breath until, the next minute chase. So you can like see the client like holding their breath, probably really anxious. Brian's yelling at Jimmy, and Jimmy does just sit there
Yeah.
and let it happen.
Bump on a log. Yeah.
Mhm.
So in real life, he would take the person into the hall.
Yeah.
I mean, I could see how you might be stunned. It might take you a minute to get yourself together, but it was a funny scene for the show, for
Yeah.
sure. Found out about this fight at the soccer game, confronts Jimmy over his lapse in ethics. and makes him promise to get his shit together and not fuck it up with Alice. So, like, the Paul character is just so funny because he's so dry, but also he cusses a lot, and it's brilliantly written. So he's don't fuck it up with Alice.
Well, and
Meanwhile,
and real quick, Paul, I might be like pulling from other episodes, but this kind of gives like context into like just how wise Paul is to what Jimmy is going through. There's like two things that always stick out to me. And this might be like in a future episode, but it like matters to this context. Um but as Paul is like figuring out what Jimmy is doing, this like new quote unquote new therapy that Jimmy is doing, Paul does have a quote where he's like, "Yeah, let's just strip clients of their autonomy. That always works." Like very
yes,
sarcastically. And then another point too, speaking of his grief, of Jimmy's grief over his wife dying. Um, there is a scene where Jimmy's like, "I've been grieving for a year," and Paul says, "You haven't been grieving, you've been numbing." Because like in the first episode, we see him like doing a lot of drugs, drinking a lot of alcohol, and that's kind of why it's like another reason why him and his daughter's relationship is strained because he's been so consumed in that. Um, so it just kind of speaks to how wise Paul is to
for
know
sure.
Jimmy really well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So then we see that Sean's at his parents' house, and his parents kick him out because he's been arrested. But he wouldn't have been arrested if he hadn't been at that soccer game with Jimmy,
Mhm.
and if Jimmy hadn't created this bad situation with this other client. So we see how Jimmy's unethical behavior and all these blurred lines are really negatively impacting his clients. Um, then Alice tells Liz that she's having dinner with her dad. So after meeting with Paul, Alice decides, okay, I am going to have dinner with my dad tonight. And that makes Liz really sad because Liz has been feeding off of this maternal role. Also,
Mhm.
that actress, I love her, and her lip filler is over the top in this.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
And it's unfortunate because she's really a beautiful woman. And
She's gorgeous.
every time I see the lip filler, I'm like, I don't understand why you decided to do that. You did not need to do that.
I it's distracting, it's so much. So anyway, that was a sidebar. So Liz feels sad, but then Alice goes home with the sandwiches and she finds Jimmy ready to go play pickleball with Brian. So Jimmy's like, "Oh, are these sandwiches for me or for us? Like, I will totally stay home and cancel pickleball, like no big deal." Like he's being vulnerable and saying, "I really wanna spend this time with you." And
Yeah.
Alice says, "No, they're for Liz." Like, she just can't be vulnerable back with him.
Mhm.
So then she takes the sandwiches and eats the sandwiches at Paul's house. And they're kind of talking. We learn that Paul really doesn't self-disclose about his personal life at all.
Mhm.
So they're just eating sandwiches and watching a game, basically. After pickleball, so Jimmy goes to play pickleball with Brian. And after pickleball, Brian's like, "Are we going to talk about this or what? Like, you haven't talked to me for a year." And Jimmy says, "I just needed to be sad and not be cheered up."
Mhm.
And because Brian's like this eternally positive guy, and he really apparently thought his role was to cheer up Jimmy, and Jimmy was like, "I just needed to be really sad for a while, and
Mhm.
that's why um I didn't talk to you." But it's a really sweet moment of reconciliation between these friends.
And great that whole scene was really great because one of Brian's like sayings throughout the episode is like everything goes my way. Like he's kind of joking, but he's kind of not. And Jimmy says it's really hard to be around someone that says everything goes my way right after your wife just died. And
Yeah.
he goes, I didn't say everything goes your way. But he like
I
apologizes and it's really sweet.
It really is, and I just love his character. In the last scene, Alice comes home and he finds Sean, who again is one of Jimmy's clients, sitting at the bar in the kitchen eating. And Jimmy comes in with a pillow and blankets under his arm and says Sean needs a place to crash for the night. So the reason Sean needs a place to crash is because his parents had kicked him out. So we see all of these results of Jimmy's actions, like it's like a domino effect of things happening.
Yeah.
Um, Also, we should not ever have our clients sleeping at our
No.
house really for any reason whatsoever. I like my ethics professor, Tom Hartzell, his voice is in my head talking about like cases where counselors have done unethical things. And this would be definitely something he would warn about. Even in the car, he said, don't ever take a client in your car
Oh
either.
yeah, they're not in the
Yeah.
car, not in your house. And then Alice is like, "What the fuck?" Rightfully so. I mean, you're wondering
Yeah.
like, Jimmy, what's going through your mind? You didn't think to consult with your teenage daughter about this like strange man suddenly living in your house? Like, it's just a terrible move on all fronts. And then as the show goes on, he continues seeing Sean as a client. Like, how fucking weird is that? You have this client that defended you physically. You had to bail him out of jail. Your friend is his lawyer. Now he's sleeping at your house, but then you're also meeting with him in your office for like regular sessions. What? How does that
Yeah.
work? Yeah.
No. If your counselor is doing any of those things, maybe reconsider who you're seeing as
Go
your
see
counselor
someone else. Yeah, that's really weird. And
for
again,
sure.
comedy show, but from a therapeutic standpoint, totally cringe and not okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that they made this show. I think it really is a good way to think about all of these counseling ethics, and I think, if I hadn't gone to grad school for counseling, I probably wouldn't know a lot about counseling ethics, and so I'm glad. I think it is educational ultimately for people to be able to see this counselor making all of these wrong choices and to really understand what are the right choices that counselors can make.
Well, and I also like it because it's done the way that it's portrayed is even as a viewer that what he's doing isn't okay because you hear from Paul and then you hear from the other counselor who works in that office like you get these opinion like people are telling Jimmy essentially what are you doing,
Yeah.
right? So the show doesn't condone the actions, which I think helps, right, in being able to watch it because if it was written in a way of like, oh, this is totally normal, I think it would not be an enjoyable show to watch.
Yeah, I think you're right. It would be too cringy. And part of what makes it entertaining is the fact that they are the conscience of the show.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. So
Awesome.
this was a fun one to watch. Yeah. And I have to say too on like random note, the actress who plays Alice, the daughter, and the actress who plays Tia, the mom, which we don't see Tia a lot because she's passed away, but we see like little flashbacks of her. They legitimately look like they could be mom and daughter.
They really do.
Yeah. So anyways, that always that like rewatching it, I was like, wow, they do look so similar.
It's a great casting. Great casting all the way around for all of these characters. I love
Absolutely.
Jason Segel. He is lovely.
Same.
Okay. We did it. If you enjoyed this episode of Real Therapy Gone Wrong, please like, review, subscribe, and follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Even if you just leave a review like loved it or a heart, that's great. It just helps us get seen by or get heard by more people. For our next episode, we will be covering the show South Park episode. For
That
our
was my
next
that
episode,
yeah, that was my
that's
fault.
okay.
I forgot to change that part.
That's okay. For our next episode, we will be covering the show South Park, season 14, episode 1, entitled Sexual Healing, which you can view on HBO Max, Hulu, YouTube, Apple TV, pretty much everywhere. If you'd like Real Therapy Gone Right, we are 2 licensed therapists. Contact us if you'd like to learn more about our work or want to hire us. You can find Lindsay at relationshipmatterstx.com or me, Brandy, at sellerscounseling.com. If you're making a movie or TV show and do not want to find us dissing your show on our podcast, we are available to consult on your project, so please get in touch.